Jeff Gural is a New York City commercial real estate developer and chairman of GFP Real Estate, which owns and manages over 13 million square feet across more than 50 properties in NYC, including the iconic Flatiron Building. He joined the family firm Newmark in 1972 and built it into a global brokerage before selling it to BGC Partners in 2011, keeping the real estate portfolio under what became GFP Real Estate. He also owns the Meadowlands Racetrack, Tioga Downs, and Vernon Downs, and has led a high-profile crusade against doping in harness racing. Jeff Gural, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. How's your day going?
My day is lousy because I cleared my schedule today I've been away for 3 weeks in Europe, and I cleared my schedule today to get get a lot of work done um, that requires my assistant, and she called in sick, so that ruined my day, which which is good because now doing this podcast is filling time that I was trying to figure out what am I going to do without an assistant.
Yeah, yeah, I guess it kind of worked out perfectly.
Yeah.
So, your father, correct, was the founder of Newmark, the brokerage.
Not really, but sort of. It was originally a company called Harris Newmark. Harris actually owned the building that they had the shirtwaist fire in, and he was actually tried for murder, I think, and was acquitted. And then I think people wanted to kill him because he killed all these people in that fire. And then when Newmark was getting ready to retire, he had my father and he sold the company to my father and a couple of other people.
So, growing up, your dad, was basically in real estate all the time. Would you
Yeah,
say, because I know you took a trip out to California, correct? Right after.
yeah. I had no interest in real estate.
No interest.
I wanted to go into construction. I got a civil engineering degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute (RPI), and at that time there were no courses in construction. When I looked for a job in New York, everybody asked me if I had any experience. I said no, and nobody. They said, "Well, come back when you have experience." And just as a lark almost because I had to tell people I was doing something. A friend of mine got accepted to Stanford and kept me company, and we drove to California. And when I got to LA and opened the newspaper, there were a lot of ads for civil engineers, and the biggest ad was from the California Division of Highways, and I got hired by them and put in a training program, which was great. I switched jobs every 6 months, so it was a lot of fun.
Would you say working in civil engineering in California made you want to go later on into real estate, like working?
No, I really wanted to do construction. So after 2 years after the training program was up, I had gotten married out in California. We had a child. We were young, but I had no interest in living there. I came back to New York, went back to the same person who told me that I needed experience, and he hired me. And I was working there for 7 years, a company called Diesel Construction, which was a very big construction company, built a lot of the high-rise office buildings. They built the Sears Tower. They built used to be the Pan Am building. Now it's I think whether it's Equitable or no, that's that's another big building, and I was very happy there. And then the guy who owned it, he was very difficult to work for. And in order to keep people working for him, he gave everybody stock in the company, including me. And he eventually sold the company to a food service company, Aramark. And at that point, I realized, that I didn't want to work for a food service company, and that most likely I'd never own Diesel. And my father was and his partners were after me to come and work for them, so I did.
No, what finally made you go and work for your dad?
The fact that the company I was working for was sold to a food service company,
But
basically.
you didn't think I'm gonna find another similar type of civil engineering.
No, I figured I'd give real estate a shot. I loved where I was working, but I didn't want to work for a company that was owned by a food service company, which ultimately, of course, turned out to be a mistake. And I think they bought the business back for a fraction of what they sold it for. Um, and that was it. And then my father agreed um, to let me work in real estate, in construction. So I started out when I was there doing buying small buildings and converting them to residential, as well as overseeing some of the management. And I learned the real estate business.
Was real estate something that was talked about in the home when you were young, or was it kind of like, oh, that's what my dad does for work?
Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't like, you read these stories where someone will say, my father took me to on the weekends to drove around Manhattan looking at buildings and all of this stuff. That was not the case. My father, we led a middle class lifestyle. We lived in Long Island, and he would take the Long Island Railroad every morning. He would take the same train and to work and the same train home almost every day. My mother would drop him off at the train station, and she would pick him up, and then we would have dinner. And I knew my father was in real estate, but we really didn't talk much about it, to be honest. Um, I had two younger sisters. My father loved to play golf, so he was a golfer on the weekends when the weather was okay, and he liked sports. But we didn't really talk much about real estate. I was really interested in construction.
It's very interesting because I was talking to another developer and they actually said the same thing that they were always interested in construction. And from construction, they were able to become a very good developer because they knew everything that was happening in construction. Is that something that you noticed that you got a type of advantage when you went to development?
Yeah, when we were a smaller company, I really oversaw a lot of the projects myself, and I was the GC, so it it helped. Now we're too big for that, so we have other people doing it. So uh, yeah, it certainly helped at the beginning when we were smaller.
What is the Flatiron auction story?
Crazy story. So we were we were running some buildings for these three women, three sisters, and they had inherited a 52% interest in the Flatiron Building from their father. And they were partners at the time with Leona Helmsley, who was notoriously difficult. Um, and this guy, Nathan Silverstein, owned 25%. He had inherited it from his father. And Leona basically never made a distribution. She was intentionally trying to force her partners to sell. So they would get hit with a tax bill every year and no income, no distribution. So at some point they just said, would you guys want to buy it really at the bottom of the market? So we purchased their 52% tenant in common interest. And then eventually, when Leona was dying or end of life, she sold her interest to a friend of mine who bought it. And then he owed me a favor because he had screwed me on something. And he said, I know I screwed you. I'll do you a favor and sell you my interest in the Flatiron Building for what I paid, whatever. So that gave us basically 71% interest in the building, our group. Um, and then we were approached by an Italian company, Sorgente, who had owned the Chrysler Building, and they had sold it, and they wanted to. They had a fund that invested in landmark buildings, so they wanted to buy the Flatiron Building from us. So Some of my partners sold their interest, so they ended up owning about 30%. We ended up owning about 40%. Nathan owned 25%, and there was a small group of Helmsley Spear people owned 4%. And Nathan was very difficult. And for a while, everything was fine because I had the building leased to a big publishing company, Holtzbrink. And essentially, I was making quarterly distributions, and everything was fine. But the Holtzbrink people were friends, and they told me that at the end of their lease, they were going to relocate because wasn't economical for them to be on 20 floors. And when I went to Nathan and my partners, I said, we're going to have to, um, gut the building and rebuild it and find office tenants to replace them. Nathan basically said, well, I don't want to spend any money. Why don't you find a tenant that'll take the building as is with no free rent, no brokerage, which is basically impossible, except there were two companies then, WeWork and Knotel, and I made it, and they were the only ones that really interested. And I made a deal with Knotel, which would have been a good deal for us because they were putting up a letter of credit. Even though they went bankrupt, we would have been able to cash in the letter of credit. But Nathan said, well, Knotel's a lousy tenant. I said, I know they're a lousy tenant, but who do you think is going to take a building as is with no free rent and no commission? A good tenant? Not a chance. So we ended up basically, excuse me, trying to convince him that we had to, you know, borrow money to rebuild the building and convert it to regular office space for multiple tenants. And Nathan said, my father told me not to borrow money. So I said, well, yeah, but this is a $150 million project. The way these projects are done is you borrow 100 million and you put up 50. So we couldn't convince him. And the only thing you can do when you have a situation like this, tenant in common, is get the courts to order a sale of what they call, uh, oh gee, I forget. There's a word for it anyway. So that's what happened, and then the building went to auction, and our plan was to basically buy out Nathan. So we were essentially bidding to on the whole building, but since we already owned 75%, we would only have to come up with the money to buy Nathan out. And I thought the building was worth 130, 140 million. And I was bidding, and there was a guy next to me who kept bidding every time I bid. And eventually, we got to 190 million, and I just stopped. I said, "This is crazy. The building's not worth 190 million." So this guy is the winning bidder, and he's getting all this press and this and that, and I said, we would consider going partners with you. He says, "Oh, that'd be great. That's what I want." Blah blah blah. And we met with him the next day, and he told us all these great plans. And then on Friday, he had to come up with a deposit, which would have been $19 million, 10%. And initially, he told the bankruptcy lawyer, the trustee for the court, his lawyer said, we'll be wiring the money in a few minutes, and no money ever came. And then a little while later, they called and they said, oh, change of plans. We're going to have Citibank wire the money in a few minutes. No money. 3 o'clock, he calls. The lawyer says his lawyer said they'll be wiring the money from Chase Bank in a few minutes. No money. So at that point, he's in default. And then on Sunday, I get a call from the trustee saying that his lawyer wants to know if they wire the money on Monday, would I accept it? So I said, well, tell him to wire the money and I'll decide. So naturally no money ever get wired. So this guy was basically a whack job. He loved the building and he wanted to buy it, and he thought that if he that he'd be able to raise the money by telling people, "Oh, I can buy the Flatiron Building, for $190 million."
But you
And
think he was overbidding?
yeah, he had no money, so he cost us money because at that point, at that point, nobody knew about the sale, so it would have probably sold for about 130 million. And the second time around, everybody knew about the sale, and it ended up selling for 161 million. Um, and basically, we were the winning bidders, and then we basically went out and found we looked for a partner to buy Nathan's interest. And we had a few people interested, and we ended up making a deal with the Brodsky organization to do a condominium, which is not something that I do, and that's what happened.
Where do you think office is going in Manhattan?
Where do I think it's going? I don't know. Right now, the market's great, but the companies that are taking space, a lot of them are these AI companies. Not all of them are going to make it. Um, I'm concerned about the high price of oil, whether that's going to cause a global recession. I don't know what's going to happen with AI. Um, so there's a lot of unknowns. Right now, everything's fine. And the thing that's helping us the most is that there's a lot of activity, people buying obsolete office buildings to convert to residential. So millions of square feet of Class B office space are being taken off the market, and that's a big help. And my company, my nephew, has been involved in a couple of those projects.
How do you think Mamdani is affecting office real estate in New York?
How do I think what?
Mamdani is affecting office real estate in New York.
I don't think he's had much of an effect. I mean, it's not the most important thing for us is public safety. So as long as he has Jessica Tisch as police commissioner, we're pretty confident that the city will stay safe. I think as far as the fact that he's a democratic socialist, you know, listen, affordability is a big problem. Income inequality is a big problem. I think long term, I worry very much about the future of our country because if we don't address um, if we don't address uh, the income inequality issue, we're in trouble. And eventually, you'll get a socialist as president, and that'll destroy the country.
Why do you think that people elect will elect? Do you think people will elect a socialist president?
If we don't solve the income inequality problem, I think they will, because what you have in this country is a small percentage of Americans living the American dream, and everybody else is struggling. Um, and I think that sooner or later, you'll get somebody uh, involved who is going to say, "Hey," like Mandami, who's going to come along and say, "Look, I'm going to tax the rich," which I think is okay, actually. I think the rich are getting a very sweet deal. Um, but uh, so somebody will come along and say, "I'm going to make your life better," and people will say, like Mandami, they're going to say, "Look, I'm going to tax the rich. I'm going to, make freeze rents. I'm going to make everything cheap." And unfortunately, socialism doesn't work. I've seen it. I was in Romania many, 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 many years ago when it was a communist country, and that's I saw it was totally depressed. I went to Cuba, which is a communist country. It was, you wouldn't want to live like that. It doesn't work. You need the profit motive. People, you know, people want to. enjoy, want to have the profit motive is important. So, um, you know, just doesn't work socialism. And the deficit, we built this huge deficit by reducing taxes on rich people, spending a fortune on the military, and you know, uh, it's backwards. It's just crazy what's happening.
What is the biggest deal that you've ever done?
Hmm. Well, I've bought a lot of buildings, but I guess most of them I bought many, many years ago when the city was not what it is today. And I bought mostly buildings that were old industrial buildings that were factories. And I guess the biggest building we own is 528th is a big deal, big building. 40 Worth is a big building. Um, I've also gotten involved in the casino industry. I own the Meadowlands racetrack, um, where I built a new racetrack. The Tioga is a $200 million casino. Um, so uh, um, you know, I've done a lot. I've done a lot of that stuff.
What is the hardest thing that you've ever done in real estate?
Hmm. When you go through these recessions, like right now, I'm involved. I have a problem. I have a building um, that I bought long ago for bargain price and uh, was very successful. And then I decided a few years ago, before COVID, that I had converted the upper three floors to residential, and I decided that I should convert the rest of the building to residential. And it turned out to be a disaster because I had sold space to a college, Nyack College, and they approached me. They heard about the project in Jersey City, and they said, we would be willing to take three floors for dorms, which they did. And then the school went bankrupt and closed, and leaving me a big problem. So that's right now that's really the biggest problem I have is that. But I've been through a lot of recessions, and it gets pretty ugly. There have been times in my career where banks wouldn't lend any money to real estate. It didn't matter who you were, and now it's different. But um, you're dealing with big numbers.
Which was worse, the savings and loans crisis or 2008?
They were all kind of the savings and loan was bad, because banks failed, um, and the RTC came along. The key to success in real estate is not to be over leveraged. So if you're not over leveraged, you'll survive to fight another day. If you're over leveraged, you're in trouble. Um, so I've been through about four or five of these, and they're tough. And if you're over leveraged, you're toast. I'm worried right now. I don't know what's going to happen. This oil crisis could cause a catastrophic recession worldwide. It can't go on. I don't know how long could it go on for, where you have, you know, 20% of the world's oil is hung up, and some of the big facilities where they produced oil have been destroyed. So it's scary. And then I don't know what is AI. What's the AI issue? Is that going to help or hurt our industry? Can't help. I don't see how it helps. You know,
You don't see AI being used to increase like productivity drastically in the real estate industry?
I just worry that they're going to use it to have that companies will need fewer workers, and that's not good for my business. You know what I mean? So
Sure.
everybody poo-poos it, but common sense. would say that once people know how to use it effectively, it's possible that they won't need all these people sitting at desks. I don't know.
What was COVID like? Because so many people went from, I'm in the office 5 days a week to like a lot of companies went from you can come in, twice a week. We don't need as many people in the office. How would
Well,
you
the
say that?
first part of it was terrible because our buildings were empty. Nobody was allowed to. You couldn't even if you wanted to work. They told you to stay home. I luckily I had a farm upstate, and I remember I was sitting on the back porch basically, um, trying to hang on. Luckily, the government came along with this that program where people could borrow money from the government. Unfortunately, a lot of fraud, and and then gradually people started coming back. I think originally we were at 3 days a week, and then we're at 4 days a week. So you can most buildings are quiet on Fridays. Is a quiet day in New York. Some of our people come in, some don't, but it's a quiet day.
Who is the most successful person you've met and what did they teach you?
I've met a lot of successful people. Uh, Larry Silverstein is a very successful, and he's my idol because he's still out there. I think he's about 95. So um, he's very successful. But a lot of a lot of successful real estate people. It's requires it's not that hard a business. You just have to have guts to a certain extent and a little bit of vision. Um, so um, that's but um, Larry is certainly someone I look up to. Um, and what he went through with the World Trade Center, and even now he's still developing. He's mid-90s. It's pretty good.
Amazing. How do you make any company, especially in real estate, how do you make that like a company survive across many different generations?
I think you need to have a good reputation, and have you need a good reputation. Like the banks, when um, the you know when it comes to borrowing money, you need the banks, and you need to have a good reputation. Um, and and you got to work hard. I micromanage, whether that's good or bad, but I think a lot of successful people micromanage. I know what's going on almost every building.
Would you say you're very data focused?
Well, because I'm an engineer, I would say that I think, trying to think of it. I think analytically, that's the word I'm looking for. So everything I do, I think analytically. I'm a back of the envelope guy. I don't rely on putting a number in a computer and having it spit out the result. I'm a back of the envelope guy.
What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I think work hard. Um, and then I got lucky because of I we bought a company, a small company, many years ago because, and one of the people that was part of that was a guy named Barry Gossin who runs Newmark, and Barry really was a key to my success. We were a great team, and um, yeah, so
What is the worst piece of advice you've ever received?
hmm, I don't know if I once heard somebody at a funeral say, I don't know why he said it. He said, "My father told me that people never take advice, especially good advice." And I found that to be true. Whenever I've given somebody advice, I don't know if they take it or not. And it's frustrating to a certain extent. Um, you
How
know,
how important would you say having a controlled ego is in real estate?
well, everybody, I don't, I think, I believe that I'm known probably more as a nice guy than a brilliant real estate guy, but that helps. The key, you have to be successful when times are bad, because when times are good, everybody's successful. So the whole key to success in our business is to have a strategy that works when times are bad. And I do, because basically when times are bad, and you have real estate brokers that are out there advising their clients, I know they're gonna say, look, if you want my opinion, Jeff is the best landlord of all of these people. He's easy to make a deal with. So I'll do better. I do better when times are bad, because I don't go for the last buck. My buildings aren't over leveraged, and I hate vacant space.
There's actually a number of people who've said the exact same thing on this podcast, where it's real estate is not about winning, it's about avoiding like losing.
Yeah, because historically downturns in real estate have always been followed by upturns. So if you lost the building during the downturn and now the upturn comes along, you're screwed. You don't own the building anymore. So, you want to be able to hang on.
If you could leave one message to the younger generation, what would it be?
I can guarantee you one thing. I'm 83. I can't believe how fast my life went by. I can't believe I'm 83. And when I meet with friends of mine from college, we're all the same age, we all say, how did this happen? I remember back when I graduated from RPI in 1964, they used to have the reunions on the same weekend as they had graduation, and the classes would line up, on the campus. And I remember I saw like a 50-year reunion, and I said to myself, I can't believe these guys are still alive. What are they doing here? And keep in mind that in 1964, probably living to 70 was the equivalent of living to 80 today, I guess. So here I am, one of them. I graduated 61 years ago, and so my advice is just make the best of it. I mean, there's three things that are going to determine the quality of your life. One, finding the right mate, whether whether it doesn't matter same sex or heterosexual, is finding the right partner. I've been married for 61 years. It's a lot easier to be married for 61 years. B, find a career that you really love, because if you're going to go to work every day, and to be successful, you got to like what you're doing. And then you got to be lucky with your health, so don't smoke, don't overeat, don't drink, try to exercise, and then you need luck. I mean, every day things happen that are, where a stray bullet hits somebody, walking down the street. You see it all the time. I saw was one yesterday, a 75-year-old grandfather. A couple of gangbangers start shooting at each other, and he's sitting on a porch, gets a bullet in the heart. You need luck. Look at Savannah Guthrie, who, you know, whose mother was kidnapped. Like, you get a phone call, like, your life is great, everything's fine, blah, blah, blah. And then somebody says, or your mother's been kidnapped. And it happens all the time. People get a call, somebody drowns, somebody gets hit by a car. a drunk driver, smashes into there was a couple month a female police lieutenant was drunk driving the wrong way on a Taconic. I think she smashes into a car, a doorman driving home from work. He's dead. She's fine. A guy was driving home. We had many, many, many years ago, the building I'm in that we owned, 515 Madison, we had an employee who was coming in on Sunday for his shift, and he was on a Metro North train that derailed. He got killed.
Well,
You know, bad luck. He was in the wrong car, right? Or his wife said he usually drives to work, but that day he decided to take the train. All he had to do was drive to work, or all he had to do was sit in a different car. You know, bad things happen to good people all the time. So
th- thank you so much for joining me. We're
okay, well, I hope you learned something. I'm
Yeah,
happy to help young people. So it was nice meeting you remotely. Thank you.
thank you. Take care.
Bye.